David Morgan settled into seat 13A with the practiced ease of someone who'd flown this route dozens of times. Average height, graying temples, reading glasses perched on his nose as he thumbed through what looked like a technical manual. Other passengers barely glanced his way. Just another middle-aged businessman heading east for another forgettable meeting. When the cabin lights dimmed unexpectedly and the captain's voice crackled with barely controlled fear over the intercom, most passengers assumed it was routine. But David's hand tightened around his armrest, and for the first time in 20 years, he wished he'd chosen a different flight. Then came the announcement that would change everything aboard Southwest Flight 1847. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a critical situation. If there is anyone on board with advanced systems engineering experience, particularly in aviation electronics, please identify yourself immediately. We need your help. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun blazed through the terminal windows at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, casting long shadows across the departure lounge at Gate A23. Tuesday crowds moved with that familiar midweek lethargy, a mixture of business, travelers clutching coffee cups like lifelines, and vacation-bound families juggling oversized carry-ons and restless children. The 2:30 p.m. departure to Boston Logan was running on time, a minor miracle that seemed to lift everyone's spirits just slightly. Southwest Flight 1847 represented the usual cross-section of American air travel. In the front rows, suits and laptops dominated the landscape. Maria Gonzalez bounced 8-year-old Sophie Turner on her knee in row 12, trying to keep her daughter entertained with coloring books and promises of ice cream in Boston. Tyler Brooks, a college junior at Arizona State, had claimed a window seat near the back, already plugged into his noise-canceling headphones and pulling up Netflix on his tablet. The flight attendants moved through their pre-flight choreography with the practiced efficiency that comes from performing the same routine thousands of times. Catherine Williams, known to her colleagues simply as Kate, had been flying these routes for 6 years. She prided herself on reading passengers, spotting the nervous flyers who'd need extra attention, the business travelers who'd want to be left alone, the families who'd require patience and understanding. Today's manifest showed a typical Tuesday. Afternoon load. Nothing unusual, nothing that set off any of her internal alarm systems. The weather report called for smooth sailing with only minor turbulence expected over the Rocky Mountains, the kind of gentle bumps that barely registered on commercial aircraft anymore. David Morgan had requested seat 13A specifically, not out of superstition but out of habit. The aisle seat in row 13 gave him quick access to the lavatory during long flights, and the location placed him far enough from the engines to minimize noise while remaining close enough to the wing to feel the aircraft's natural rhythm. He'd learned these preferences during countless flights in his previous career, though none of his fellow passengers would have guessed that the tired-looking man in the rumpled khakis and polo shirt had once been responsible for monitoring spacecraft trajectories from mission control centers that didn't officially exist. The boarding process unfolded with typical Southwest efficiency. David presented his boarding pass to the gate agent with a polite nod, made his way down the jet bridge, and found his seat without fanfare. He placed his worn leather briefcase in the overhead compartment, keeping only a thick technical manual and a small notebook for the flight. Robert Chun, a pharmaceutical sales representative from Tucson, had claimed 13B and was already deep in conversation with someone on his phone, discussing quarterly projections and market penetration statistics. The two men acknowledged each other with the brief, impersonal nod that characterized most airplane interactions. As passengers continued filing aboard, David opened his manual to a chapter on integrated navigation systems, making occasional notes in handwriting so precise it looked almost mechanical. The casual observer might have assumed he was reviewing boring technical documentation for his day job, perhaps something related to industrial equipment or manufacturing processes. They wouldn't have recognized the diagrams as schematics for the exact type of flight management computers that controlled the very aircraft they were boarding. Captain Lisa Torres completed her pre-flight inspection with the thoroughness that had earned her recognition as one of Southwest's most reliable pilots. 15 years of commercial aviation experience, starting with regional carriers and working her way up to major routes, had given her an almost supernatural ability to sense when something felt off about an aircraft. Today, everything checked out perfectly. The Boeing 737-800 was one of the newer planes in Southwest's fleet, with maintenance logs that read like a love letter to proper aircraft care. Co-pilot James Park, newer to the Southwest family but carrying impressive credentials from his military aviation background, settled into his seat and began the systematic ritual of pre-flight preparations. Radio checks, navigation system initialization, weather briefing review, flight plan confirmation. The route to Boston would take them northeast over New Mexico, across the Oklahoma Panhandle, through Kansas and Missouri, then over Indiana and Ohio before the final approach into Logan. 4 hours and 15 minutes of routine commercial aviation, the kind of flight that both pilots could handle in their sleep. At exactly 2:28 p.m., 2 minutes ahead of schedule, Flight 1847 pushed back from Gate at 23. The tug driver, a veteran of 23 years with the ground crew, maneuvered the aircraft with the casual precision that comes from moving multi-million-dollar machines multiple times every day. Captain Torres received clearance from ground control, and the Boeing's twin engines spooled up with that distinctive whine that frequent flyers recognize immediately. David glanced out the window as they taxied toward runway 8R, watching the familiar dance of aircraft, ground vehicles, and airport personnel that kept American aviation functioning. Phoenix Sky Harbor handled over 40 million passengers annually, a number that still amazed him when he considered the complexity of coordinating so many moving parts. His previous career had given him deep appreciation for systems that worked flawlessly while remaining largely invisible to their end users. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The takeoff was textbook perfect. Captain Torres had executed thousands of departures, and today's liftoff felt as smooth as any in her career. The aircraft climbed steadily through the clear Arizona sky, banking gently northeast as it settled into its planned flight path. Phoenix fell away below them, the desert landscape stretching endlessly in all directions, dotted with subdivisions and golf courses that looked like green jewels against the tan backdrop. For the first 90 minutes, Flight 1847 represented everything that commercial aviation aspires to be. Smooth flight, professional crew, content passengers. Maria Gonzalez had successfully negotiated Sophie into a nap using her own shoulder as a pillow. Tyler Brooks had found a documentary about ocean exploration and was completely absorbed. Robert Chun had finished his phone calls and was reviewing spreadsheets on his laptop. Kate Williams moved through the cabin checking on passengers, refilling drinks, and maintaining the pleasant but professional demeanor that kept everyone comfortable. David had made significant progress through his technical manual, occasionally pausing to sketch diagrams in his notebook. The subject matter was dense enough to require serious concentration, but he'd spent enough years working with similar systems that the concepts felt familiar rather than challenging. To the casual observer, he appeared to be just another business traveler using flight time productively, catching up on work-related reading while traveling to his next appointment. The first indication that something was wrong came from the cockpit rather than the passenger cabin. James Park noticed an inconsistency in the navigation display, a minor discrepancy between GPS Readings and the inertial navigation system that probably represented nothing more than routine calibration drift. He made a note to mention it to maintenance in Boston, then dismissed it as the kind of minor technical anomaly that modern aircraft were designed to handle automatically. Captain Torres was reviewing their approach options for Logan International when the primary communications system began displaying error messages. Not failure warnings, not emergency indicators, just subtle suggestions that something in the radio management system wasn't functioning at optimal levels. She ran through the standard troubleshooting procedures, cycling power to various components, and checking backup systems. Everything appeared to be working normally, yet the error messages persisted. The first real sign of trouble came when Denver Center tried to hand off Flight 1847 to Kansas City Approach Control. The routine radio call that should have been automatic instead resulted in confusion, with air traffic controllers reporting they were receiving intermittent signals from the Southwest flight. Captain Torres could hear incoming transmissions clearly, but her outgoing communications were apparently reaching ground control only sporadically. In the passenger cabin, most travelers remained completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. The flight felt normal, the engine sounded healthy, and the aircraft was maintaining its assigned altitude and heading without any noticeable problems. David, however, had closed his technical manual and was paying closer attention to subtle cues that most passengers wouldn't recognize. The slight change in engine pitch that suggested the autopilot was making frequent minor corrections. The pattern of wing flex that indicated the aircraft was compensating for navigation inconsistencies. The barely perceptible vibration that suggested electronic systems were cycling on and off more frequently than normal. James Park was the first to realize they were dealing with something more serious than routine equipment malfunctions. The integrated flight management system was displaying conflicting information about their position, altitude, and heading. GPS indicated they were exactly where they should be, but the inertial navigation system suggested they'd drifted several miles south of their planned route. The backup navigation system provided a third set of coordinates that disagreed with both primary systems. Captain Torres made the decision to begin troubleshooting procedures while continuing toward Boston, but she also started mentally preparing for the possibility that they might need to declare an emergency and divert to an alternate airport. The nearest suitable facility was Kansas City International, approximately 40 minutes ahead at their current speed and altitude. She began reviewing approach procedures for MCI while James Park worked through increasingly complex diagnostic procedures. The situation deteriorated rapidly when weather radar began showing a severe thunderstorm system moving across their planned route, a massive cluster of cells that hadn't appeared on earlier forecasts. Normally, this would represent a routine deviation, the kind of weather avoidance that commercial pilots handle dozens of times each week. Today, however, their navigation problems made weather deviation significantly more complicated and potentially dangerous. David had been monitoring radio chatter through the headphone jack in his armrest, a trick he'd learned during his years working with aviation systems. The conversations between Flight 1847 and various air traffic control centers were becoming increasingly tense, with controllers expressing concern about the aircraft's unpredictable radio communications and apparent navigation inconsistencies. He could hear the professional stress in Captain Torres's voice as she tried to maintain normal operations while dealing with cascading system failures. The announcement that would change everything came at 4:47 p.m., approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes into what should have been a routine flight to Boston. Captain Torres had reached the point where she could no longer maintain the illusion that everything was under control. The combination of navigation system failures and communication problems, complicated by severe weather that was making normal routing impossible, had created a situation that required resources beyond what the flight crew could provide. Her voice came over the cabin intercom with the kind of controlled tension that immediately captured everyone's attention. Professional, calm, but carrying an undertone that made passengers stop their conversations and look toward the speakers. Mounted in the overhead compartments. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Torres speaking. We're currently experiencing some technical difficulties with our navigation and communication systems. While these issues do not represent an immediate safety threat, we're going to be diverting to Kansas City International Airport as a precautionary measure. However, I need to ask for assistance from our passengers. The cabin fell completely silent. Even Sophie Turner, who had been coloring in her activity book, looked up at her mother with wide, concerned eyes. Tyler Brooks pulled off his headphones. Robert Chun closed his laptop. Kate Williams moved to the front of the cabin, her training kicking in as she prepared to assist with whatever was coming next. Captain Torres continued, her voice steady but urgent. We have a critical situation with our flight management systems. If there is anyone on board with advanced systems engineering experience, particularly in aviation electronics or navigation systems, please identify yourself immediately. We need your help to safely navigate through the weather system ahead of us and reach Kansas City. David felt every muscle in his body tense as the implications of that announcement settled over him. 20 years of carefully maintained anonymity. 2 decades of deliberately ordinary existence, suddenly threatened by circumstances completely beyond his control. He'd spent considerable effort ensuring that his background remained buried in classified files and forgotten databases, living as unremarkably as possible while carrying knowledge that few people on Earth possessed. But as he looked around the cabin at the faces of 155 fellow passengers, including 8-year-old Sophie Turner and her mother Maria, he realized that his comfortable obscurity was about to end. Because the truth was that David Morgan did possess exactly the kind of specialized knowledge that Captain Torres was desperately seeking. And despite every instinct telling him to remain silent, to let someone else step forward, to maintain the anonymity that had protected him for so long, he knew he couldn't sit quietly while the aircraft and everyone aboard faced a crisis that he might be uniquely qualified to resolve. The technical manual in his lap contained detailed schematics for the exact navigation systems that were currently failing. His notebook was filled with handwritten notes about flight management computer architecture that he'd helped design during his previous career. And hidden in his briefcase was identification that would have shocked his fellow passengers' credentials. From organizations that most people assumed existed only in movies and conspiracy theories. David Morgan, former senior systems engineer for NASA's classified aerospace projects, former consultant to agencies whose names were redacted from public documents, former designer of navigation systems for aircraft that didn't appear on any official registry, was about to step out of the shadows that had protected him for 20 years. The silence that followed Captain Torres's announcement stretched across the cabin like a physical weight, heavy and oppressive in the recycled air. David felt the eyes of nearby passengers scanning the rows, looking for someone to step forward, someone who might possess the expertise their pilot desperately needed. Robert Chun turned in his seat, studying David's technical manual with newfound interest, though he couldn't possibly understand the complex diagrams and formulas that filled its pages. Maria Gonzalez instinctively pulled Sophie closer, her maternal instincts recognizing the gravity of a situation where airline pilots asked passengers for help. The 8-year-old sensed her mother's tension and began to fidget, her coloring book forgotten as she picked up on the adult anxiety surrounding her. Tyler Brooks had completely abandoned his documentary, his young face reflecting the confusion and growing fear that rippled through the passenger compartment. Kate Williams stood at the front of the cabin, her training telling her to project calm confidence, while her experience warned her that pilots didn't make announcements like this unless the situation was genuinely serious. She'd been through emergency scenarios in training, practiced responses to medical emergencies, equipment failures, and security threats. But she'd never encountered a situation where the flight crew actively solicited technical assistance from passengers. That level of vulnerability from the cockpit suggested problems beyond the scope of standard emergency procedures. David's mind raced through the implications of what he'd just heard. Navigation system failures in modern commercial aircraft were rare but not unprecedented. The Boeing 737-800 was equipped with multiple redundant systems specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Primary GPS navigation, backed up by inertial reference systems, backed up by VOR navigation, backed up by manual piloting techniques that every commercial pilot learned during basic training. For Captain Torres to be asking for passenger assistance meant that multiple layers of redundancy had failed simultaneously, creating a cascade of problems that standard procedures weren't designed to handle. The technical manual in his lap contained detailed information about the integrated flight management systems used in modern commercial aircraft. Not the simplified overviews found in general aviation publications, but the deep technical specifications that only systems engineers and specialized technicians normally accessed. The notes in his personal notebook included modifications and improvements to navigation algorithms that he'd developed during his years working with agencies whose existence was classified at levels most people never imagined. 20 years ago, David Morgan had been one of a small group of engineers responsible for designing navigation systems for aircraft that officially didn't exist. Black projects that pushed the boundaries of aerospace technology, developing capabilities that wouldn't appear in civilian applications for decades. His work had involved creating navigation systems that could function without GPS, without ground-based radio beacons, without any external reference points except the most basic laws of physics and mathematics. The irony wasn't lost on him that the skills he'd developed for the most advanced aircraft in the world might now be needed to save a routine commercial flight. The same principles that allowed military aircraft to navigate in GPS-denied environments could potentially help Flight 1847 work around whatever was causing their current navigation problems. But revealing that knowledge would mean exposing himself, abandoning the carefully constructed ordinary life he'd built after leaving government service. Captain Torres's voice came over the intercom again, this time with less of the professional calm that had characterized her earlier announcements. I want to emphasize that we are not in immediate danger. However, we're dealing with multiple system malfunctions that are making navigation difficult, and we have severe weather between our current position and Kansas City. Any passenger with relevant technical experience, please don't hesitate to identify yourself. The desperation in that second appeal was unmistakable, at least to someone with David's background. He'd heard that same tone in mission control centers when routine operations suddenly went sideways, when backup systems failed to engage, when highly trained professionals reached the limits of their standard procedures and began looking for alternatives that existed outside normal protocols. David closed his technical manual and placed it carefully on his tray table. He folded his hands in his lap and took a slow, deep breath, mentally preparing himself for a conversation he'd hoped never to have. After 20 years of anonymity, of deliberately boring existence, of carefully avoiding any situation that might draw attention to his background, he was about to step back into the world of high-stakes technical problem-solving. Robert Chun noticed David's change in posture and demeanor. The businessman had been studying his seatmate with growing curiosity, noting the precision of his handwriting, the complexity of the diagrams he'd been reviewing, the obvious familiarity with technical concepts that seemed far beyond typical business documentation. "You know something about this stuff, don't you?" Chun asked quietly, gesturing toward the manual. David turned to meet his eyes, and Chun was struck by a sudden shift in the man's presence. The tired, unremarkable passenger who'd boarded the flight in Phoenix seemed to have been replaced by someone with quiet confidence and sharp intelligence. "I might be able to help," David said simply, his voice carrying a certainty that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty that had filled the cabin since the captain's announcement. Kate Williams had been trained to observe passenger behavior during emergencies, watching for signs of panic, medical distress, or unusual reactions that might require intervention. She noticed David's transformation immediately, the way he'd straightened in his seat, the change in his facial expression from passive to actively engaged. Something about his response to the captain's call for help suggested genuine expertise, rather than merely wishful thinking or misguided helpfulness. The flight attendant made her way down the aisle, stopping beside row 13. "Sir, did you want to speak with the captain?" she asked, keeping her voice low to avoid attracting unnecessary attention from other passengers who might be watching for any sign of hope or progress. David looked up at her, noting the professional competence in her manner despite the stress of an unusual situation. "Yes, I think I should," he replied. "I have some background in aviation systems that might be relevant to their current problems." Kate evaluated his response, looking for the overconfidence or desperation that sometimes led unqualified people to volunteer during emergencies. Instead, she saw calm assessment and what appeared to be genuine capability. "What kind of background?" she asked, needing to make sure she wasn't about to waste the cockpit crew's valuable time with someone who'd watched too many aviation documentaries. "Systems engineering," David replied without elaborating. "Navigation and flight management. Computers specifically. I've worked with similar problems before." The understated nature of his response actually increased Kate's confidence in his qualifications. In her experience, people who genuinely knew what they were talking about tended to be precise and conservative in their claims, while those who were bluffing or exaggerating usually provided much more dramatic self-assessments. "I'll let the captain know," she said, already reaching for the interphone. As Kate made her way toward the front of the aircraft, David felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced in 20 years, the knowledge that his decisions and actions would have direct consequences for other people's lives. During his government career, he'd worked on projects where failure could mean mission compromise or equipment loss, but rarely had the stakes been so immediate and personal. The passengers around him were ordinary people going about their daily lives when circumstances beyond their control had placed them in jeopardy. Maria Gonzalez was probably traveling to visit family or attend a business meeting. Sophie Turner was simply along for the ride, trusting in the adults around her to keep her safe. Tyler Brooks was likely heading back to college or going home for a visit. Robert Chun was pursuing his career in pharmaceutical sales, probably thinking about quarterly reports and customer meetings rather than navigation system failures. None of them had asked to be part of an aviation emergency, but here they were, dependent on the skills and knowledge of people they'd never met. Captain Torres and co-pilot Park were undoubtedly competent professionals, but they were facing a situation that had moved beyond the scope of standard commercial aviation training. The weather system ahead of them was severe enough to require navigation precision that their failing systems couldn't provide. Kansas City International was their nearest suitable alternative, but reaching it safely would require capabilities that normal procedures couldn't guarantee. David opened his briefcase and removed a small leather portfolio that he hadn't touched in years. Inside were identification documents that most people would never see, credentials from organizations whose names appeared in conspiracy theories rather than organizational charts. His security clearance had officially expired when he left government service, but the knowledge and experience that had earned those clearances remained as sharp as ever. The portfolio also contained contact information for people who could verify his background, though making those calls would certainly attract attention he'd spent 2 decades avoiding. David hoped it wouldn't come to that he could resolve Flight 1847's problems without involving his former colleagues or revealing more about his past than absolutely necessary. Kate Williams returned within minutes, accompanied by a sense of urgency that suggested the cockpit situation was deteriorating. "The captain would like to speak with you immediately," she said, her professional composure intact, but with an underlying tension that indicated genuine concern. "She asked me to escort you to the flight deck." David stood, leaving his technical manual and notebook on his seat, but taking the leather portfolio with him. Robert Chun watched with obvious curiosity as his seatmate transformed from anonymous fellow traveler to someone whose expertise was apparently needed to address a serious crisis. "Good luck," Chun said quietly, and David nodded in acknowledgement. The walk to the front of the aircraft felt longer than usual, partly because of the weight of responsibility he was carrying, and partly because he was acutely aware of the passengers he was passing. Each face represented someone whose safety might depend on his ability to help solve problems that had stumped the professional flight crew. Children who trusted adults to keep them safe. Elderly passengers who'd earned peaceful travels after lifetimes of hard work. Young people with their whole lives ahead of them, assuming they could reach Kansas City safely. Kate Williams knocked on the cockpit door using the security protocol that had become standard after September 11th. David could hear brief conversation through the door, then the sound of locks disengaging. When the door opened, he found himself looking at Captain Torres, whose professional demeanor couldn't quite hide the stress of dealing with multiple system failures while trying to maintain normal operations. "I understand you have some background in navigation systems," she said without preamble, gesturing for him to enter the cockpit. The flight deck of a commercial airliner was cramped even under normal circumstances, and David had to navigate carefully around the seats and control panels to position himself where he could see the displays without interfering with the crew's movements. Co-pilot James Park was working through a thick manual, cross-referencing symptoms with troubleshooting procedures and trying to identify patterns in the various system malfunctions they were experiencing. He looked up as David entered, sizing up the passenger volunteer with the kind of professional skepticism that came from years of dealing with people who thought they understood aviation better than they actually did. "What kind of systems experience do you have?" Captain Torres asked, her tone suggesting she hoped for genuine expertise, but was prepared for disappointment. She'd been flying long enough to encounter passengers who confused flight simulator experience with real-world knowledge. People who meant well but lacked the depth of understanding necessary to address serious technical problems. David looked at the instrument panel, quickly identifying the various displays and controls that he'd studied in technical manuals, but had never seen in an actual commercial cockpit. The layout was similar to military aircraft he'd worked with, but with different prioritization and organization that reflected civilian operational requirements rather than combat mission parameters. "I spent 15 years working on integrated navigation systems for specialized aircraft," he replied, choosing his words carefully to convey competence without revealing classified details. "I'm familiar with GPS integration, inertial reference systems, flight management computers, and backup navigation procedures." James Park exchanged a glance with Captain Torres. The terminology was correct, and the passengers' assessment of their displays suggested genuine familiarity with aviation systems. "What kind of specialized aircraft?" Park asked, his skepticism beginning to give way to cautious optimism. David hesitated, knowing that any detailed answer would reveal more about his background than he wanted to share. "Government contracts," he said finally. "Aircraft that required navigation capabilities beyond standard civilian specifications." Captain Torres felt a spark of hope for the first time since their problems had begun. Someone with military or government aviation experience might actually understand the complexities of what they were facing, might have encountered similar problems and developed solutions that weren't covered in commercial aviation procedures. "Here's what we're dealing with," she said, gesturing toward the instrument panel. "Primary GPS is giving us inconsistent position reports. Inertial reference system is showing gradual drift that doesn't match our known flight path. Flight management. Computer is generating error codes that don't appear in our troubleshooting manual. And our communication systems are intermittent, which means air traffic control isn't getting reliable position reports from us." David studied the displays, noting patterns that the flight crew probably hadn't recognized because their training focused on individual system operations rather than integrated system interactions. His background in systems engineering allowed him to see relationships between seemingly unrelated malfunctions, to identify cascade failures that created problems beyond the sum of their individual components. "The errors aren't random," he said after several minutes of observation. "There's a pattern here that suggests a common cause affecting multiple systems simultaneously. This isn't equipment failure in the traditional sense. Something is interfering with your electronic systems in a way that creates consistent but incorrect data." James Park leaned forward, intrigued by David's assessment. What kind of interference could affect GPS, inertial navigation, and communications? All at the same time? David's expression grew serious as he considered the implications of what he was seeing. The pattern of malfunction suggested something he'd encountered before, but in contexts involving aircraft and missions that officially didn't exist. "Electronic warfare systems," he said quietly. "Someone is jamming your navigation and communication signals in a coordinated fashion." The cockpit fell silent as the implications of that statement settled over the flight crew. Electronic warfare was something they associated with military operations in hostile territory, not commercial flights over the American heartland. The idea that someone might be deliberately interfering with civilian aircraft was both terrifying and almost incomprehensible. Captain Torres found her voice first. "Are you suggesting that someone is intentionally targeting our aircraft?" David shook his head. "Not necessarily targeting you specifically, but there's definitely coordinated electronic interference affecting your systems. The question is whether it's intentional or whether you've flown into the effect radius of something that's not meant for civilian aircraft." He paused, studying the error patterns more closely, cross-referencing what he was seeing with knowledge gained from years of working with aircraft that operated in electronically contested environments. "The good news is that if I'm right about this, there are workarounds. Navigation techniques that don't depend on the systems that are being jammed." James Park felt a surge of hope tempered by uncertainty. "What kind of workarounds?" David smiled for the first time since entering the cockpit, the expression transforming, his tired features and revealing glimpses of the confidence that had made him valuable to government programs that pushed the boundaries of aerospace technology. "Dead reckoning," he said simply. "The way pilots navigated before GPS, before computers, before any of the electronic systems you're used to depending on. Pure mathematics, physics, and careful observation. It's not as precise as modern navigation, but it's completely immune to electronic interference, and it's more than accurate enough to get us to Kansas City safely." The jet bridge extended toward Flight 1847 with a mechanical hiss that seemed unusually loud in the aftermath of their emergency landing. David gathered his belongings methodically, placing his navigation charts back in their protective sleeve and securing his calculator in the leather portfolio that had remained closed for so many years. The cockpit felt smaller now, cramped with the residual tension of crisis management and the awkwardness of three people who had shared an intense experience but barely knew each other. Captain Torres was completing her post-flight checklist with the kind of methodical precision that characterized professional pilots, but David could see the exhaustion in her movements. Managing an aircraft through multiple system failures while coordinating with air traffic control and integrating advice from an unknown passenger had required sustained concentration and decision-making under pressure. The successful landing represented professional competence of the highest order, but David knew that the captain would be replaying every decision and procedure for weeks to come. James Park was documenting their emergency procedures in the aircraft logbook, creating the official record that would be scrutinized by airline safety departments, Federal Aviation Administration investigators, and insurance companies seeking to understand exactly what had happened to Southwest Flight 1847. His entries were concise and factual, but David noticed that the co-pilot was struggling with how to describe the passenger technical assistance that had been crucial to their safe arrival. "What should I put down for your qualifications?" Park asked, pen poised over the logbook. "The investigators are going to want detailed information about anyone who provided technical assistance during an emergency." David had been dreading this moment since he first stepped into the cockpit. Official reports meant official scrutiny, background checks, and inquiries that could uncover information he had spent 20 years trying to keep buried. The successful resolution of their emergency had required revealing enough of his expertise to solve immediate problems. But the aftermath would inevitably involve questions that he couldn't answer without exposing classified information. "David Morgan, systems engineer with experience in aviation electronics," he replied, choosing words carefully to provide accurate information without revealing sensitive details. "You can reference my assistance with alternative navigation techniques." When primary systems were compromised, Captain Torres looked up from her checklist, recognizing the diplomatic nature of David's response. Her years of experience with military and government aviation had taught her to recognize the careful word choices that people used when discussing classified work. "The investigators are going to want more specific information about your background and qualifications," she said. "Emergency assistance from passengers requires detailed documentation." David understood the requirement, but he also understood the complications that detailed documentation would create for him personally. His former colleagues in government service had made it clear that maintaining a low profile was essential for his continued safety and privacy. Getting involved in official investigations would certainly attract attention from people and organizations that he had successfully avoided for 2 decades. "I understand the requirement," he replied. "I have contact information for people who can verify my qualifications if necessary, though it may take some time to coordinate through proper channels." James Park finished his logbook entries and secured the flight documentation that would be required for their post-flight reporting. The paperwork represented only the beginning of what would be an extensive investigation into the causes of their system failures and the effectiveness of their emergency response procedures. Southwest Airlines would conduct its own internal review. The FAA would investigate the navigation system problems, and other agencies might become involved if the electronic warfare explanation proved accurate. "We should probably escort you off the aircraft," Captain Torres said to David. "The airline is going to want to interview anyone who provided assistance during the emergency, and there may be other officials who need to speak with you." David had been hoping to blend back into the passenger crowd and disappear before anyone had time to organize formal interviews or investigations. His preference was always to avoid official scrutiny whenever possible, a habit developed during years of working on projects where anonymity was both a professional requirement and a personal safety measure. "I'd prefer to avoid unnecessary publicity," he said carefully. "My assistance was straightforward technical consultation. I'm not sure that extensive interviews would provide additional useful information." Captain Torres exchanged a glance with co-pilot Park, both of them recognizing that their passenger consultant was trying to minimize his involvement in their emergency response. They understood the desire for privacy, but they also understood that official procedures required thorough documentation of emergency incidents, especially those involving passenger assistance with technical problems. I'm afraid it's not really optional, Torres said apologetically. Federal regulations require detailed reporting of all emergency procedures, including any assistance provided by passengers. The investigators need to understand exactly what happened and how we resolved our navigation problems. David nodded reluctantly, accepting the inevitable consequences of his decision to help resolve their crisis. He had known from the moment he stepped into the cockpit that his involvement would create complications for his carefully maintained low profile. But he had been unable to sit quietly while facing a situation where his expertise could save lives. The cockpit door opened to reveal Kate Williams waiting in the forward galley area, her professional demeanor intact, but her eyes reflecting the strain of managing passenger concerns during an extended emergency situation. Behind her, David could see passengers gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, most of them probably eager to reach solid ground after their unexpected diversion to Kansas City. The gate agents are asking about passenger assistance during the emergency, Kate reported to Captain Torres. They want to coordinate interviews before people disperse through the terminal. David felt a familiar tension building in his chest, the same anxiety that had characterized his final months in government service when operational security concerns began conflicting with his desire for normal life. He had left federal employment specifically to avoid this kind of scrutiny and complexity, but circumstances had conspired to place him exactly where he had hoped never to be again. "I'll speak with whoever needs information," he said, resignation evident in his voice. "But I'd appreciate keeping this as brief and private as possible." Kate nodded understanding, recognizing that their passenger consultant valued privacy even though his expertise had been crucial to their safe arrival. "I'll let them know you're cooperating but prefer to keep things low-key." The three of them made their way toward the aircraft door, passing through the passenger cabin where people were collecting carry-on luggage and preparing to leave the aircraft that had carried them through an emergency they were only beginning to understand. David noticed that many passengers looked tired and shaken, the stress of an unscheduled landing and extended flight time evident in their faces and body language. Maria Gonzalez was helping Sophie Turner gather her coloring books and toys, the 8-year-old more interested in the excitement of visiting a new airport than concerned about the technical problems that had brought them to Kansas City. Children often adapted to unusual circumstances better than adults, their natural resilience helping them process experiences that might be traumatic for older passengers. Tyler Brooks was checking his phone for messages and trying to coordinate with family members who would be expecting him in Boston, not Kansas City. The college student looked frustrated by the disruption to his travel plans, though he probably had no idea how serious their situation had actually been during the flight. Robert Chun watched David pass through the cabin with obvious curiosity, clearly wondering what had happened during the extended cockpit consultation that had begun when their seatmate responded to the captain's call for technical assistance. The businessman had observed David's transformation from anonymous fellow traveler to someone whose expertise was needed to address a serious emergency. As they reached the aircraft door, David could see Southwest Airlines personnel waiting in the jet bridge, clipboards and tablets ready for the post-incident interviews and documentation that would be required before passengers could be released to continue their travel arrangements. The sight of official personnel preparing for formal procedures confirmed his fears about becoming entangled in bureaucratic processes that could expose his carefully guarded background. A woman in a Southwest Airlines supervisor uniform approached Captain Torres immediately, her demeanor reflecting the professional concern that airlines exhibited when dealing with emergency situations. "Captain Torres, I'm Janet Morrison, station manager for Kansas City operations. We need to conduct interviews with crew and any passengers who provided assistance during your emergency." David introduced himself to Morrison, providing basic identification while hoping to limit the scope of his involvement in their post-incident procedures. David Morgan. I provided some technical consultation regarding navigation alternatives when the aircraft experienced system malfunctions. Morrison made notes on her tablet while studying David with the analytical gaze of someone trained to assess unusual situations and potential complications. What kind of technical background qualified you to assist with aviation navigation? Problems? The question was straightforward and reasonable, but David knew that any detailed answer would lead to follow-up questions that would become increasingly difficult to address without revealing classified information. Systems engineering with experience in aviation electronics, he replied, using the same careful phrasing he had provided to the flight crew. We'll need more specific information for our incident report, Morrison continued. Federal Aviation Administration investigators will be reviewing this case, and they require detailed documentation of all emergency assistance provided by passengers. David felt the familiar weight of official scrutiny beginning to settle over him, the same pressure he had experienced during his final years in government service, when security concerns and operational requirements created increasingly complex situations. He had hoped that leaving federal employment would allow him to avoid this kind of bureaucratic entanglement, but circumstances had conspired to place him squarely in the middle of exactly the kind of situation he had been trying to avoid. I understand the documentation requirements, he said carefully. I have contacts who can provide verification of my qualifications through appropriate channels, though it may require coordination with security offices that handle classified information. Morrison's expression sharpened at the mention of classified information and security offices, recognizing that their passenger consultant's background was more complex than typical civilian aviation experience. Airlines dealt occasionally with passengers who had military or government backgrounds, but those situations usually involved straightforward verification procedures rather than references to classified programs and security clearances. Are you suggesting that your qualifications involve classified information? She asked, her tone reflecting growing concern about the complications this might create for their incident investigation. David nodded reluctantly, knowing that his admission would create exactly the kind of attention and scrutiny he had been hoping to avoid. Some aspects of my background are covered by security agreements that limit what information I can discuss publicly. I can provide contact information for appropriate verification, but it will need to be handled through official channels. Captain Torres had been listening to the conversation with growing understanding of David's situation and growing appreciation for the personal risk he had accepted when he stepped forward to provide assistance during their emergency. His willingness to help despite the potential consequences for his privacy demonstrated the kind of character that she associated with the best military and government personnel she had encountered during her aviation career. Mr. Morgan's assistance was crucial to our safe arrival, she told Morrison. His expertise in alternative navigation techniques allowed us to work around system failures that could have created a much more serious situation. I strongly recommend that any investigation recognize the valuable service he provided. Morrison was balancing multiple competing concerns as she tried to manage the post-incident procedures that were required following their emergency landing. Southwest Airlines needed to complete thorough documentation to satisfy federal investigators and insurance companies, but she also needed to be sensitive to privacy concerns and security issues that might be involved with passenger assistance. From someone with a classified government background, we'll coordinate with appropriate authorities to handle any security considerations, she assured David. Our primary concern is documenting the facts of what happened and how the emergency was resolved. Your cooperation is appreciated, and we'll try to minimize any inconvenience to your privacy. David appreciated Morrison's professional approach, but he knew from experience that investigations involving classified backgrounds often developed momentum and complexity that extended far beyond initial intentions. Once official channels became involved, security offices and oversight agencies tended to conduct thorough reviews that could expose information he had spent years trying to keep private. James Park had been observing the conversation with growing concern about the complications that might arise from their passenger consultant's classified background. Should we be concerned about operational security issues? Are there potential problems with documenting classified assistance in our official reports? The question highlighted exactly the kind of complications that David had been hoping to avoid when he decided to maintain a low profile after leaving government service. Commercial aviation incidents were subject to extensive documentation and public reporting requirements that were completely incompatible with the security considerations that surrounded classified government programs. We'll work through appropriate channels to handle any security considerations, David replied, though he knew that such coordination would inevitably involve contacts with former colleagues and government agencies that he had been avoiding for 20 years. The important thing is that everyone arrived safely. Morrison was making additional notes on her tablet while trying to develop a plan for handling the unusual circumstances of their emergency response procedures. We'll need to coordinate with our legal department and possibly with federal agencies that handle security clearances and classified information. This may take some time to resolve properly. David felt a familiar sense of resignation settling over him as he contemplated the bureaucratic processes that would now inevitably unfold around his involvement in Flight 1847's emergency. He had known from the moment he stepped into the cockpit that his decision to help would have consequences for his carefully maintained anonymity, but he had been unable to ignore a situation where his expertise could prevent potential tragedy. "I'll provide whatever cooperation is necessary," he said to Morrison. "I just ask that you handle this as discreetly as possible given the security considerations involved." Morrison nodded understanding while continuing to work through the procedural requirements that would govern their post-incident investigation. "We'll coordinate with appropriate authorities and try to minimize any public attention or unnecessary complications for your privacy." Captain Torres was reviewing her own post-flight responsibilities while listening to the conversation about David's background and the complications it might create for their emergency documentation. "Is there anything we should be aware of regarding operational security or classified information that might affect our incident reports?" David considered the question carefully, weighing the need to provide adequate information for aviation safety purposes against the security concerns that had governed his professional life for so many years. "The navigation techniques I suggested are not classified, though my familiarity with them comes from classified programs. The assistance I provided can be documented without exposing sensitive information." The distinction was important for managing the intersection between aviation safety requirements and national security considerations. Emergency response procedures needed to be thoroughly documented to prevent similar incidents in the future, but that documentation couldn't compromise classified programs or expose sensitive information about government aviation capabilities. Morrison was coordinating with her supervisors via radio, while trying to manage the multiple competing requirements that were involved in their post-incident procedures. Southwest Airlines needed to satisfy federal investigators, insurance companies, and internal safety departments while also respecting the privacy and security concerns of a passenger whose assistance had been crucial to resolving their emergency. "We're going to set up a private interview room where we can handle this more discreetly," she announced after completing her coordination calls. "That should allow us to gather the necessary information while maintaining appropriate security considerations." David appreciated the effort to provide privacy, though he knew that formal interviews would inevitably lead to more extensive investigation and scrutiny than he had experienced since leaving government service. The successful resolution of Flight 1847's emergency had required revealing enough of his background to establish credibility with the flight crew, but the aftermath would require much more detailed disclosure to satisfy official investigation. Requirements. Kate Williams had been coordinating with ground personnel to expedite passenger processing, while the crew dealt with post-incident procedures that were required following their emergency landing. Most passengers are eager to continue their travel arrangements, she reported to Captain Torres. But several people have asked about the passenger who provided technical assistance during the flight. David felt his stomach tighten at the mention of passenger curiosity about his involvement in their emergency response. He had hoped that his assistance would remain largely unnoticed by the general passenger population, but the extended cockpit consultation and obvious coordination with the flight crew had apparently attracted attention from observant travelers. "What kind of questions are people asking?" Morrison inquired, concerned about potential publicity or media attention that could complicate their incident investigation procedures. Kate consulted her notes from conversations with passengers during the disembarkation process. Mostly curiosity about what kind of technical problems required passenger assistance and who was qualified to help resolve navigation system failures. A few people mentioned that they noticed unusual expertise from someone who appeared to be an ordinary business traveler. The observations confirmed David's fears about attracting unwanted attention through his involvement in their emergency response procedures. His careful cultivation of an unremarkable public persona had been compromised by circumstances that required revealing enough expertise to establish credibility with professional flight crews dealing with complex technical problems. Morrison was weighing the potential for media attention against the operational requirements for thorough incident investigation and documentation. "We'll need to manage public information carefully to protect privacy while satisfying regulatory requirements for transparency in aviation safety reporting." David understood the challenge Morrison was facing, but he also understood that his own priorities differed significantly from those of Southwest Airlines and federal investigators. His primary concern was minimizing exposure and returning to the anonymity that had protected him for 20 years, while their concerns focused on thorough documentation and regulatory compliance that could enhance aviation safety for future operations. "I'd appreciate any efforts to minimize publicity or public attention," he said to Morrison. "My assistance was straightforward technical consultation that shouldn't require extensive media coverage or public discussion." Morrison nodded agreement, while continuing to coordinate the complex procedural requirements that were involved in their post-incident investigation. "We'll handle media inquiries carefully and focus public statements on technical aspects of our emergency response procedures, rather than personal information about individual passengers." The commitment provided some reassurance, though David knew from experience that media attention and public curiosity could develop unpredictable momentum once stories began circulating about unusual incidents involving government backgrounds and classified expertise. His involvement in Flight 1847's emergency had already exposed more of his background than he had revealed in 20 years of civilian life. The private interview room at Kansas City International Airport felt smaller than its actual dimensions, cramped with the accumulated tension of 3 hours of detailed questioning and the presence of officials from multiple agencies who had arrived throughout the afternoon. David sat across from a conference table lined with representatives from Southwest Airlines, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Department of Transportation, and 2 individuals whose credentials identified them only as federal security investigators with agencies whose names he recognized from his former career. Morrison had coordinated the interview process with the professional efficiency that characterized airline crisis management, but David could see the strain in her demeanor as she tried to balance competing demands for information from investigators who didn't always share the same priorities or security clearances. The complexity of documenting passenger assistance that involved classified backgrounds had created bureaucratic challenges that extended far beyond routine incident reporting. The FAA investigator, a career aviation safety specialist named Patricia Hendricks, had been methodical in her questioning about the technical details of Flight 1847's navigation, system failures, and the alternative procedures that David had recommended to resolve their emergency. Her focus remained strictly on aviation safety issues and operational procedures that could be incorporated into future emergency response training. Your assessment of coordinated electronic interference was confirmed by our technical analysis of the aircraft's recorded data, Hendricks reported. We've identified signal patterns that match known electronic warfare signatures, though the source of that interference remains under investigation by other agencies. David had expected that confirmation, though he was surprised by how quickly. The investigators had been able to analyze the flight data and correlate it with electronic warfare databases. The rapid response suggested coordination between aviation authorities and defense agencies that indicated his involvement had attracted attention at much higher levels than routine passenger assistance cases. The Department of Transportation Representative Michael Chun had been focused on broader implications of electronic interference with commercial aviation and the potential need for new regulations or procedures to address similar incidents in the future. Your recommendations for alternative navigation procedures could be valuable for developing emergency protocols that don't rely on GPS or satellite-based systems, he noted. David appreciated the focus on practical applications that could enhance aviation safety, but he was increasingly concerned about the scope of investigation that was developing around his background and qualifications. Each question led to follow-up inquiries that required more detailed explanations of his experience and expertise, gradually exposing information he had successfully kept private for 2 decades. The 2 federal security investigators had been the most challenging to deal with, their questions probing aspects of his government service that touched on classified programs and sensitive information. Agent Sarah Richardson and Agent Mark Stevens carried credentials from agencies that David recognized from his former career, organizations that handled security investigations and background verification for classified programs. Our records show that you held security clearances at levels that would have provided access to highly sensitive aviation and aerospace programs, Richardson stated. Can you provide more specific information about the nature of your government service and the programs you were involved with? The question represented exactly the kind of inquiry that David had been hoping to avoid when he decided to help Flight 1847 resolve its navigation emergency. Detailed discussion of his classified background would inevitably lead to contact with former colleagues and supervisory personnel who had been part of programs that officially didn't exist in public records. I worked on systems engineering projects for specialized aircraft that required advanced navigation capabilities, David replied, choosing his words carefully to provide accurate information without exposing classified details. The specific programs were classified at levels that prevent me from discussing operational details without proper authorization. Agent Stevens consulted his notes while studying David with the analytical gaze of someone trained to assess security risks and potential complications. Who would be appropriate contacts for verifying your background and obtaining necessary authorization for more detailed discussion of your qualifications? David had been dreading this question since the interview process began, knowing that providing contact information would inevitably result in communication with people and organizations he had been avoiding since leaving government service. His former supervisors and colleagues represented connections to a life and career that he had deliberately left behind when he decided to pursue civilian employment and personal anonymity. Admiral James Whitfield at the Pentagon would be the appropriate contact for verification of my security clearances and government service, he said reluctantly. Colonel Patricia Barnes at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base could verify my work on aviation systems projects. Both of them would need to coordinate through appropriate security channels. Richardson made detailed notes while coordinating with her colleagues about the procedures that would be required for contacting senior military officials and obtaining verification of classified backgrounds. This may take several days to coordinate properly through security channels. Will you be available for follow-up interviews if additional information is needed? David nodded agreement while contemplating the disruption that extended investigation would create for the quiet life he had built in civilian employment. His current job as a consulting engineer for a renewable energy company had provided exactly the kind of unremarkable, professional routine that allowed him to maintain anonymity and avoid attention from former colleagues or government agencies. Morrison had been observing the interview process with growing concern about the complexity and scope of investigation that was developing around what should have been straightforward documentation of passenger assistance during an aviation emergency. How long is this investigation likely to continue? Are there operational implications for Southwest Airlines that we need to be aware of? Hendricks consulted her preliminary findings while coordinating with her superiors about the broader implications of electronic warfare affecting commercial aviation. The technical aspects of our investigation should be completed within a few weeks, assuming we can obtain adequate cooperation from other agencies investigating the source of electronic interference. Mr. Morgan's assistance will be documented as a positive factor in your emergency response procedures. David appreciated Hendricks' focus on technical issues rather than personal background, but he understood that the security investigation would likely continue long after the aviation safety review was completed. His involvement in resolving Flight 1847's emergency had created connections between his classified past and current civilian life that could prove difficult to manage or contain. Agent Richardson was coordinating with her supervisors about the timeline for conducting background verification and security review procedures. We'll need to conduct additional interviews after we've had time to verify your government service and consult with appropriate security personnel. This investigation could continue for several months, depending on the complexity of the programs you were involved with. The prospect of months of ongoing investigation and scrutiny represented exactly the kind of sustained official attention that David had been hoping to avoid when he left government service. His decision to help resolve Flight 1847's navigation emergency had been motivated by immediate humanitarian concerns, but the consequences were extending far beyond the scope of assistance he had intended to provide. "I understand the investigative requirements," he said to Richardson. "I'll provide whatever cooperation is necessary, but I'd appreciate efforts to minimize disruption to my current employment and personal life." Richardson nodded understanding while making additional notes about coordination requirements and potential complications that might arise from investigating someone with David's classified background. "We'll try to handle this discreetly, but security investigations involving classified programs have procedural requirements that can't always be expedited or simplified." Morrison was reviewing her own responsibilities for Southwest Airlines internal investigation while trying to understand the broader implications of the federal security review that was developing around their passenger consultant. Are there operational security concerns that could affect Southwest Airlines or our reporting procedures? Agent Stevens considered the question while consulting with his colleagues about the appropriate level of information that could be shared with civilian airline personnel. "Mr. Morgan's assistance during your emergency was legitimate and valuable. There are no security concerns related to Southwest Airlines operations, though our investigation of his background will need to follow established procedures for reviewing classified information." The assurance provided some relief for Morrison's concerns about airline liability and operational security, but David understood that the distinction between legitimate assistance and security investigation might become blurred as federal agencies conducted their review procedures. His involvement with Flight 1847 had created exactly the kind of intersection between civilian operations and classified backgrounds that generated complex bureaucratic processes. Hendricks was completing her preliminary report while coordinating with other investigators about information sharing and joint investigation procedures. From an aviation safety perspective, Mr. Morgan's assistance represents exactly the kind of expertise and quick thinking that we hope to see during emergency situations. His recommendations will be incorporated into our guidance for handling similar electronic interference incidents. David felt some satisfaction knowing that his involvement might contribute to improved emergency procedures that could help other flights facing similar challenges, but that positive outcome was overshadowed by his concern about the personal consequences of exposing his background to official scrutiny after 20 years of civilian anonymity. The interview session concluded with coordinating arrangements for follow-up contact and additional investigation procedures that would be required over the coming weeks and months. David provided current contact information while trying to prepare mentally for the disruption that sustained official attention would create for his carefully constructed civilian life. As the various investigators and airline personnel gathered their materials and prepared to leave, David found himself alone with Morrison for the first time since the interview process had begun. The Southwest Airlines supervisor looked tired and somewhat overwhelmed by the complexity of managing an incident investigation that had evolved far beyond routine emergency response documentation. "I want to thank you again for your assistance during our emergency," Morrison said. "Captain Torres made it clear that your expertise was crucial to resolving our navigation problems and reaching Kansas City safely." David appreciated the recognition, though he was still processing the implications of everything that had transpired since he stepped into Flight 1847's cockpit to provide technical assistance. "I'm glad I could help. The important thing is that everyone arrived safely." Morrison studied him with the analytical gaze of someone who had spent years managing complex operational situations and assessing people under pressure. "Can I ask why you were traveling on our flight? Were you heading to Boston on business?" The question was casual and conversational, but David recognized the underlying curiosity about his background and circumstances that had led to his presence on Flight 1847 during their navigation emergency. "I was traveling to visit family," he replied, providing accurate information without elaborating on personal details. Morrison nodded understanding while considering the remarkable coincidence that had placed someone with David's specialized expertise on an aircraft that experienced exactly the kind of emergency where his knowledge would prove crucial. "It's fortunate that you were aboard when we needed technical assistance. Most flights don't carry passengers with your kind of background." David had been contemplating the same coincidence throughout the afternoon, wondering about the probability calculations that had led to his presence on Flight 1847 when Captain Torres needed expertise in electronic warfare and alternative navigation techniques. The statistical likelihood seemed remarkably low, though he understood that improbable events occurred regularly in the complex systems that governed modern aviation and travel. "Sometimes circumstances align in unexpected ways," he said diplomatically, avoiding speculation about coincidence or providence that might attract additional attention to his involvement in their emergency response. Morrison was preparing to coordinate with her airline supervisors about the ongoing investigation and its implications for Southwest Airlines operations and procedures. "Will you be continuing your travel to Boston, or are you planning to remain in Kansas City until the investigation is completed?" David had been considering his travel options throughout the afternoon, weighing his desire to continue his planned family visit against the practical complications of being involved in an ongoing federal investigation. His original travel plan seemed increasingly unrealistic given the scope of official attention that his assistance had attracted. I'll probably remain in Kansas City for a few days while the initial investigation procedures are completed. He replied, "Depending on how long the security review takes, I may need to postpone my visit to Boston." Morrison understood the personal disruption that extended investigation could create for someone who had provided voluntary assistance during an emergency situation. Southwest Airlines will cover your accommodation and meal expenses while you're required to remain available for investigation purposes. It's the least we can do considering your cooperation and the assistance you provided. David appreciated the gesture, though he was more concerned about the professional implications of extended absence from his current employment than about travel expenses. His consulting work with renewable energy projects required regular communication with clients and colleagues who weren't accustomed to unexplained absences or delays in project deliverables. As they prepared to leave the interview room, Morrison paused to consider the broader implications of what had transpired aboard Flight 1847 and during the subsequent investigation procedures. This has been unlike any emergency situation I've encountered during my career with Southwest Airlines. The combination of technical problems, passenger expertise, and security considerations has created complications I never anticipated. David nodded agreement while reflecting on his own surprise at how quickly his decision to provide technical assistance had evolved into a complex investigation involving multiple federal agencies and extensive background verification procedures. I don't think any of us anticipated how complicated this would become when I first stepped into the cockpit to help with navigation problems. Morrison was coordinating final arrangements for the ongoing investigation while trying to return her attention to routine operational responsibilities that had been postponed during the extended interview process. The investigators mentioned that follow-up interviews might be required over the coming weeks. "Will you be available if additional questions arise?" David confirmed his availability while contemplating the personal and professional adjustments he would need to make to accommodate ongoing investigation procedures. His involvement in resolving Flight 1847's emergency had effectively ended his 20-year hiatus from government attention and official scrutiny, creating circumstances that would require careful management to minimize disruption to his civilian life. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the windows of Kansas City International Airport as David finally left the interview room and made his way toward the terminal's main concourse. The other passengers from Flight 1847 had long since continued their travels or found alternative transportation, leaving him as the only remaining connection to an emergency that had attracted far more official attention than anyone had initially anticipated. As he walked through the terminal, David reflected on the sequence of decisions and circumstances that had led to his current situation. His choice to provide technical assistance during Flight 1847's navigation emergency had been motivated by immediate humanitarian concerns and professional responsibility, but the consequences had extended far beyond the scope of help he had intended to provide. The investigation procedures that were now unfolding would inevitably reconnect him with former colleagues and government agencies that he had successfully avoided for 20 years. His carefully constructed civilian anonymity had been compromised by circumstances that required revealing enough of his classified background to establish credibility with professional flight crews facing complex technical problems. David understood that there was no returning to the comfortable obscurity he had maintained since leaving government service. His involvement in resolving Flight 1847's emergency had created official documentation and bureaucratic processes that would persist long after the immediate investigation was completed. The quiet life he had built as a consulting engineer would need to be adjusted to accommodate ongoing security review procedures and potential future contact with federal agencies. Despite the personal complications his assistance had created, David felt satisfaction knowing that his expertise had contributed to the safe Arrival of 156 passengers and crew members who might otherwise have faced a much more serious emergency. Captain Torres and co-pilot Park had demonstrated exceptional professionalism and skill under pressure, but their navigation problems had required specialized knowledge that existed outside the scope of routine commercial aviation training. Successful resolution of Flight 1847's emergency would contribute to improved procedures for handling similar electronic interference incidents in the future. Aviation safety authorities would incorporate lessons learned from their experience into training programs and emergency protocols that could help other flight crews facing comparable challenges. As David arranged ground transportation to a nearby hotel where he would wait for follow-up contact from federal investigators, he contemplated the irony that his first involvement in aviation emergency procedures since leaving government service had occurred aboard a routine commercial flight rather than in the specialized aircraft and classified programs where he had developed his expertise. The intersection of his classified past with civilian aviation had created exactly the kind of complex situation that he had been hoping to avoid when he chose consulting engineering over continued government service. But the successful outcome of Flight 1847's emergency demonstrated that his specialized knowledge remained valuable and relevant even in contexts far removed from the classified programs where he had originally acquired his expertise. 20 years of civilian anonymity had ended with a captain's call for passenger assistance and a decision to step forward when his specialized knowledge could prevent potential tragedy. The investigation procedures that were now unfolding would determine whether David could successfully navigate the intersection of his classified past with his civilian present, or whether his involvement in Flight 1847's emergency would force him to make fundamental changes to the quiet life he had carefully constructed away from government service. As evening settled over Kansas City International Airport, David Morgan found himself once again connected to the world of classified programs and official scrutiny that he had left behind 2 decades earlier. The passenger in seat 13A had become something much more complicated than he had ever intended. But the 156 people who had safely reached Kansas City that afternoon would forever remember the quiet man whose expertise had guided them through an emergency that could have ended very differently. The story of Flight 1847's emergency would become part of aviation safety records and training materials, but David's role would remain largely anonymous to the general public, protected by the same security considerations that had governed his government career. He had returned to official attention not through choice but through circumstance, proving that some forms of expertise and responsibility could never be completely abandoned, only temporarily set aside until the moment when they were needed most. 3 months after Flight 1847's emergency landing in Kansas City, David Morgan stood in the parking lot of his consulting firm's office building in Denver, staring at a black sedan with government license plates that he recognized from his years in federal service. The vehicle had been parked there for over an hour, its occupants undoubtedly conducting surveillance while waiting for his workday to conclude. The sight triggered a familiar mixture of resignation and anxiety that he had hoped never to experience again after leaving government employment 2 decades earlier. The federal investigation into his background and involvement in Flight 1847's emergency response had proceeded exactly as he had anticipated, with methodical thoroughness that left no aspect of his classified service unexamined. Admiral Whitfield and Colonel Barnes had provided the verification that security investigators required, but their cooperation had also triggered broader reviews of programs and personnel that extended far beyond David's individual case. Agent Richardson had maintained regular contact throughout the investigation, coordinating interviews and security briefings that gradually revealed the scope of official interest in David's background and current circumstances. The initial focus on documenting his assistance during Flight 1847's emergency had evolved into a comprehensive security review, that examined his 20 years of civilian employment and assessed potential implications of his continued access to classified information. The renewable energy consulting firm where David had worked for the past 8 years had been subjected to security investigations that created exactly the kind of professional disruption he had been hoping to avoid. His colleagues and supervisors had been interviewed about his work performance, travel patterns, and professional relationships, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and curiosity that made normal business operations increasingly difficult. David's current project involved designing control systems for a wind energy installation in Wyoming, technical work that drew on his engineering expertise without requiring the specialized knowledge that had made him valuable to classified programs. The irony wasn't lost on him that his efforts to build a completely ordinary professional life had been undermined by circumstances that forced him to reveal the extraordinary background he had spent years trying to forget. The black sedan's presence confirmed his suspicion that the investigation had reached conclusions that would require another major life transition. Federal agencies didn't conduct surveillance of former government employees unless they intended to make offers or demands that couldn't be communicated through normal channels. David had been expecting this moment since his first interview with security investigators, but the reality of renewed government interest still felt overwhelming. As he walked toward his own vehicle, the sedan's passenger door opened to reveal Agent Richardson, who approached with the professional demeanor that characterized all of her interactions, but with an underlying tension that suggested unusual urgency. "Mr. Morgan, we need to discuss some developments in our investigation that require your immediate attention." David had been preparing mentally for this conversation since the investigation began, but the reality of renewed government contact still created the same anxiety that had motivated his decision to leave federal service originally. "What kind of developments?" he asked, though he suspected he already understood the general nature of what Richardson was about to propose. Richardson gestured toward the sedan while consulting her secure communication device for updated instructions from her supervisors. "There have been additional incidents involving electronic interference with commercial aviation, incidents that match the signature patterns from Flight 1847. We need your expertise to help investigate and potentially resolve these problems." The request represented exactly the kind of renewed government involvement that David had been dreading throughout the investigation process. His assistance during Flight 1847's emergency had demonstrated continued capability in areas where few other people possessed comparable expertise, making him a valuable resource for addressing similar problems that were apparently occurring with increasing frequency. "How many additional incidents are we talking about?" David asked, recognizing that the scope of the problem would determine the level of government response and the extent of his potential involvement in addressing the situation. Richardson consulted her secure notes while coordinating with her colleagues in the sedan about information that could be shared in an unsecured environment. 14 confirmed incidents over the past 2 months, affecting flights operated by 7 different airlines. The pattern suggests coordinated testing or deployment of electronic warfare capabilities targeting civilian aviation infrastructure. The scale of the problem was larger than David had anticipated, representing a systematic threat to commercial aviation that would inevitably attract attention from the highest levels of government. Electronic warfare capabilities sophisticated enough to affect multiple airlines simultaneously suggested foreign intelligence operations or domestic terrorism activities that posed national security implications beyond routine aviation safety concerns. "Are we talking about foreign government involvement or domestic threats?" David inquired, understanding that the source of electronic warfare capabilities would determine which agencies had jurisdiction and what kind of response would be considered appropriate. Richardson exchanged glances with her colleagues before providing information that had obviously been cleared for sharing with David, despite his civilian status. Intelligence analysis suggests foreign government involvement, possibly related to testing capabilities for future operations against American transportation infrastructure. The coordination and sophistication indicate resources beyond what domestic terrorist organizations typically possess. David felt a familiar chill as he contemplated the implications of foreign intelligence operations targeting American civilian aviation. His years of government service had involved projects designed to counter exactly this kind of threat, developing defensive capabilities and countermeasures that could protect critical infrastructure from electronic warfare attacks. "What kind of assistance are you looking for?" he asked, though he understood that Richardson's presence and the surveillance operation indicated a formal request for renewed government service rather than casual consultation. Richardson opened a leather portfolio containing documents that David recognized as security agreements and employment contracts, similar to those he had signed during his original government career. "We're requesting that you accept a consulting position with a joint task force that's been established to investigate and counter electronic warfare threats to civilian aviation. Your expertise in navigation systems and electronic countermeasures would be crucial to our response efforts." The formal nature of the request confirmed David's suspicion that his involvement in Flight 1847's emergency had effectively ended his civilian anonymity and created circumstances that would require him to choose between renewed government service and potential prosecution for refusing to cooperate with national security investigations. "What would this consulting position involve?" David asked, recognizing that his decision would determine whether he could continue his current life or would need to make fundamental changes to accommodate government service requirements. Richardson provided additional documents while coordinating with her supervisors about the scope of information that could be shared during initial recruitment discussions. "The task force is based in Colorado Springs, which would allow you to maintain your current residence while working on classified projects. The position would involve investigating electronic warfare incidents, developing countermeasures, and potentially deploying defensive systems on commercial aircraft." The location and scope of work represented exactly the kind of arrangement that David had hoped to avoid when he originally left government service. But the national security implications of the electronic warfare threat made refusal increasingly difficult to justify. His expertise in the specific technical areas that were being targeted made him uniquely valuable for addressing problems that could affect millions of travelers and critical transportation infrastructure. "What's the timeline for this position?" David inquired, understanding that emergency response to ongoing threats typically involved immediate deployment and extended commitments that would fundamentally alter his personal and professional arrangements. Richardson consulted her secure communication device while receiving updated instructions from her supervisors about recruitment procedures and operational requirements. "We need you to begin immediately. The electronic warfare incidents are increasing in frequency and sophistication, suggesting that whoever is responsible is preparing for larger-scale operations that could severely disrupt American aviation." The urgency of the timeline confirmed David's understanding that he was being presented with a choice between voluntary cooperation and potential compulsion through security agreements and legal obligations that remained in effect despite his years of civilian employment. His security clearances had never been formally revoked, creating continuing obligations that could be enforced if national security concerns required his expertise. "I'll need time to review the documents and consider the implications for my current employment and personal commitments," David replied, though he understood that Richardson's presence indicated that delay might not be an acceptable option given the scope of the national security threat. Richardson nodded understanding while making it clear that the government's patience for deliberation was limited by operational requirements that demanded immediate response to ongoing electronic warfare activities. "We can provide 24 hours for your decision, but the task force needs to be operational by the end of the week. Additional incidents could occur at any time, and we need your expertise available for immediate deployment." David accepted the documents while contemplating the personal and professional disruption that renewed government service would create for the life he had built over the past 20 years. His consulting work, personal relationships, and carefully maintained anonymity would all be affected by returning to the classified world he had deliberately left behind. The black sedan departed after Richardson completed her recruitment presentation, leaving David alone in the parking lot with government contracts that would fundamentally alter his future if he chose to sign them. The documents represented both an opportunity to contribute to national security and a return to the complex world of classified programs and official scrutiny that he had spent 2 decades avoiding. That evening, David sat in his Denver apartment, reviewing the government contracts while considering the implications of each provision and requirement that would govern his renewed federal service. The consulting position offered substantial compensation and the opportunity to work on challenging technical problems, but it also involved security obligations and lifestyle restrictions that would eliminate most aspects of civilian privacy and anonymity. The electronic warfare threat that had been revealed through his investigation represented exactly the kind of national security challenge that had originally motivated his government career. Foreign intelligence operations targeting American transportation infrastructure posed risks that extended far beyond individual flights to encompass economic stability and public confidence in critical systems that millions of people depended on daily. David's expertise in navigation systems and electronic countermeasures had been developed specifically to address threats like those currently affecting commercial aviation. His years of civilian consulting had maintained his technical knowledge, while providing perspective on civilian infrastructure, vulnerabilities that could be valuable for developing comprehensive defensive strategies. The decision to accept or decline the government consulting position would determine whether David could continue the quiet civilian life he had built or would need to return to the classified world where his expertise was considered essential for national security. Either choice would have profound implications for his personal relationships, professional commitments, and future options. As midnight approached, David completed his review of the government contracts while reaching the conclusion that his involvement in Flight 1847's emergency had effectively ended his ability to remain uninvolved in national security issues that required his specialized knowledge. The electronic warfare threat was too serious to ignore, and his expertise was too valuable to waste on civilian projects when American aviation infrastructure was under systematic attack. The following morning, David called Agent Richardson to accept the consulting position with the Joint Task Force investigating electronic warfare threats to civilian aviation. His decision represented both a personal sacrifice and a professional obligation, returning him to government service not through choice, but through circumstances that made his continued civilian anonymity impossible to maintain. The renewable energy consulting firm where David had worked for 8 years expressed disappointment but understanding when he submitted his resignation to accept a classified government position. His colleagues had suspected throughout the investigation that his background involved more than routine engineering work, and his departure confirmed their speculation about his connection to national security programs. David's transition back to government service proceeded with the efficiency that characterized military and intelligence operations when national security priorities required immediate action. His security clearances were reactivated, his access to classified facilities was restored, and his assignment to the Joint Task Force was processed through expedited procedures that reflected the urgency of the electronic warfare threat. Colorado Springs facility, where David reported for his new position, looked remarkably similar to the government installations where he had worked 2 decades earlier. Security procedures, access controls, and operational protocols reflected the same attention to classification and compartmentalization that had governed his original federal career, creating an environment that felt simultaneously familiar and unwelcome. The Joint Task Force investigating electronic warfare threats to civilian aviation included personnel from multiple agencies and military services, representing the kind of interagency coordination that indicated high-level government concern about foreign intelligence operations targeting American transportation infrastructure. David's role as senior technical consultant placed him at the center of efforts to understand and counter sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. The briefings David received during his first week confirmed that the electronic warfare threat was more extensive and sophisticated than he had initially understood. The incidents affecting commercial aviation represented only the visible portion of a broader foreign intelligence operation that was probing vulnerabilities in multiple aspects of American transportation and communication infrastructure. David's expertise in navigation systems and electronic countermeasures proved immediately valuable for analyzing the technical signatures of electronic warfare incidents and developing defensive capabilities that could protect civilian aircraft from future attacks. His understanding of both military-grade electronic warfare systems and civilian aviation vulnerabilities provided perspective that few other technical personnel could offer. The work was challenging and meaningful, involving cutting-edge technology and national security implications that made his previous consulting projects seem mundane by comparison. David found himself energized by technical problems that pushed the boundaries of his expertise and contributed to protecting millions of travelers from sophisticated foreign intelligence operations. However, the return to government service also brought renewed exposure to the security concerns and lifestyle restrictions that had originally motivated his decision to leave federal employment. His personal relationships, travel arrangements, and professional communications were all subject to security review and potential restrictions that eliminated most aspects of civilian privacy. The irony wasn't lost on David that his attempt to help resolve Flight 1847's navigation emergency had led directly to renewed government service addressing the same type of electronic warfare threats on a national scale. His decision to step forward during a civilian aviation crisis had effectively ended his 20-year hiatus from classified programs and returned him to exactly the kind of work he had been trying to avoid. 6 months after accepting the consulting position with the Joint Task Force, David had successfully developed countermeasures that significantly reduced the vulnerability of commercial aircraft to electronic warfare attacks. His work contributed to deployment of defensive systems that protected civilian aviation from foreign intelligence operations while maintaining the operational efficiency that airlines required for profitable operations. The electronic warfare threat had been contained through a combination of technical countermeasures, diplomatic pressure, and intelligence operations that disrupted foreign capabilities targeting American transportation infrastructure. David's expertise had been crucial to achieving successful outcomes that protected both national security interests and civilian aviation operations. But the successful resolution of the electronic warfare crisis had also confirmed David's value to government agencies dealing with sophisticated technical threats that required specialized knowledge. His renewed involvement in classified programs had created expectations for continued service that would be difficult to decline if future national security challenges required his expertise. As David reflected on the year since Flight 1847's emergency landing in Kansas City, he understood that his decision to provide technical assistance during a civilian aviation crisis had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his life. The quiet anonymity he had maintained for 20 years had been replaced by renewed government service that offered professional satisfaction but eliminated most aspects of civilian privacy and independence. The passenger who had occupied seat 13A on Southwest Flight 1847 had been transformed into a senior government consultant whose expertise was considered essential for protecting American transportation infrastructure from foreign intelligence operations. David Morgan had discovered that some forms of knowledge and responsibility could never be completely abandoned, only temporarily set aside until circumstances required their application for purposes larger than individual preference or convenience. The successful protection of civilian aviation from electronic warfare threats represented a meaningful contribution to national security, but it had come at the cost of the civilian life that David had spent 2 decades building. His involvement in Flight 1847's emergency had proven that extraordinary circumstances could require ordinary people to make extraordinary sacrifices, even when those sacrifices meant abandoning carefully constructed anonymity to serve purposes that extended far beyond personal comfort or preference. 2 years had passed since David Morgan's life changed forever aboard Southwest Flight 1847, and he now found himself standing in the departure lounge at Denver International Airport, waiting to board another commercial flight. This time, however, his travel was official government business, coordinated through security channels that ensured his movements remained classified and his identity protected from public attention. The Joint Task Force had evolved into a permanent program, and David's role as senior technical consultant had become an integral part of America's defense against sophisticated electronic warfare threats. The gate area buzzed with the familiar sounds of commercial aviation, passengers checking phones, families coordinating travel plans, and business travelers managing last-minute conference calls. To the casual observer, David appeared to be just another government contractor heading to Washington for routine meetings, his appearance carefully crafted to blend into the anonymous crowd of federal employees who comprised a significant portion of Denver's daily air traffic to the nation's capital. But David's mission was far from routine. Intelligence agencies had detected preliminary indicators of a new electronic warfare campaign targeting multiple aspects of American transportation infrastructure simultaneously. The threat assessment suggested foreign operations of unprecedented scale and coordination, potentially involving cyber warfare capabilities combined with traditional electronic interference techniques that could disrupt aviation, railroad, and maritime navigation systems across multiple regions. His briefcase contained classified analysis of electronic signatures that had been detected during recent probing operations, technical data that revealed disturbing advances in foreign electronic warfare capabilities since the original incidents that had brought David back to government service. The sophistication and coordination of the new threat indicated resources and planning that extended far beyond the testing operations they had successfully countered 2 years earlier. As David waited for boarding to begin, he noticed a familiar figure approaching from the direction of the security checkpoint. Captain Lisa Torres, wearing her Southwest Airlines uniform, was walking toward the same gate with the confident stride that characterized experienced commercial pilots. Their eyes met across the waiting area, and David saw immediate recognition, followed by what appeared to be genuine pleasure at an unexpected encounter. "David Morgan," Torres said as she approached, extending her hand in greeting. "I was hoping I might run into you again someday, though I wasn't sure if you'd still be traveling commercially given your government work." David shook her hand while quickly assessing the security implications of this chance encounter with someone who knew details about his classified background and technical expertise. "Captain Torres, it's good to see you again. I didn't expect to encounter anyone from Flight 1847 during routine travel." Torres studied his appearance with the analytical eye of someone who had observed him under extreme pressure and recognized subtle changes in his demeanor and presentation. "You look like government service is agreeing with you, though I imagine you can't discuss much about what you've been working on since Kansas City." David appreciated Torres's understanding of security considerations, while simultaneously feeling the weight of compartmentalized information that prevented him from sharing most details about his work over the past 2 years. "It's been challenging and meaningful work," he replied diplomatically. "I've been able to contribute to programs that help protect civilian aviation from the kind of threats we experience together." Torres nodded understanding while glancing at the departure board to confirm their shared flight information. "Are you traveling to Washington on business related to aviation security? I know that's probably classified, but I'm curious about whether your work has applications beyond the specific problems we encountered." David considered how much information he could share without violating security protocols, while providing enough detail to satisfy Torres's legitimate curiosity about programs that had grown out of their shared emergency experience. "I'm consulting on programs that address electronic warfare threats to transportation infrastructure. The work has expanded significantly since the original incidents that brought me back to government service." Torres's expression reflected both professional interest and personal concern about the implications of expanded electronic warfare threats to commercial aviation. As a senior captain with Southwest Airlines, she had participated in numerous briefings about security threats and defensive measures, but her direct experience with electronic interference had given her perspective that most pilots never acquired. "Have there been additional incidents similar to what we experienced on Flight 1847? She asked, keeping her voice low to maintain conversation privacy in the crowded gate area. David hesitated before providing information that was classified, but relevant to Torres's professional responsibilities and personal safety. "There have been additional incidents, though our defensive measures have been effective at reducing their impact on civilian operations. The threat continues to evolve, which is why ongoing research and development efforts remain important." Torres understood the careful nature of David's response while recognizing the underlying confirmation that electronic warfare threats to commercial aviation represented ongoing concerns rather than resolved problems. Her experience during Flight 1847's emergency had provided first-hand understanding of how vulnerable civilian aircraft could be to sophisticated electronic interference, knowledge that few commercial pilots possessed. Their conversation was interrupted by the boarding announcement for their shared flight to Washington Dulles, a routine Southwest Airlines departure that would transport them across the country in aircraft equipped with the latest defensive systems that David's team had developed and deployed over the past 2 years. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that their reunion was occurring aboard another commercial flight, though this time under circumstances where electronic warfare threats were anticipated and countermeasures were in place. As they moved through the boarding process, David found himself assigned to seat 13A once again, a coincidence that brought back vivid memories of the emergency that had changed his life so dramatically. Torres was deadheading to Washington as part of her crew rotation, traveling in uniform but not working the flight, which allowed her to continue their conversation as fellow passengers rather than in her professional capacity. "It's remarkable that you're in the same seat number where this all began," Torres observed as they settled into their respective seats, she in 14B directly behind David's familiar aisle position. David had noticed the seat assignment coincidence, but had chosen not to comment on it, recognizing that such observations might suggest superstition or sentimentality that wasn't appropriate for someone in his current professional role. "Coincidences happen more frequently than people expect," he replied pragmatically. "Random seat assignments occasionally produce patterns that seem meaningful, but are actually just statistical variations." Torres smiled at David's technical explanation while understanding that his analytical approach to coincidence reflected the systematic thinking that had made his expertise so valuable during their emergency. "I prefer to think of it as the universe providing opportunities for important conversations," she said. "Speaking of which, I've been wondering whether your experience during our emergency influenced your decision to return to government service." The question touched on personal motivations and decision-making processes that David rarely discussed, even with colleagues who held appropriate security clearances. His choice to accept renewed government service had been influenced by multiple factors, including professional obligation, national security concerns, and personal recognition that his expertise was too valuable to waste on civilian projects. When serious threats required immediate attention, the electronic warfare threat revealed through our experience was too serious to ignore, David replied carefully. My expertise in the relevant technical areas made it difficult to justify remaining uninvolved when American transportation infrastructure was under systematic attack. Torres understood the sense of professional responsibility that had motivated David's return to government service while recognizing the personal sacrifices that classified work typically required. Her own military aviation background had provided insight into the competing demands between personal preference and professional obligation that characterized careers involving national security responsibilities. Have you been able to maintain any aspects of civilian life, or has government service required complete transition back to classified programs? She asked, recognizing that David's answer might be limited by security considerations, but curious about the personal implications of his career change. David considered how to respond to Torres's question without revealing operational security information while providing honest insight into the personal challenges of renewed government service. It's been necessary to make significant adjustments to civilian relationships and activities, he said. Classified work requires lifestyle modifications that affect most aspects of personal life outside the immediate work environment. Torres nodded understanding based on her own experience with the security requirements and travel demands that characterized aviation careers involving sensitive operations. I imagine it's been challenging to readjust to security protocols and classification requirements after 20 years of civilian employment. David appreciated Torres's understanding of the adjustment challenges while recognizing that his transition back to classified work had been complicated by changes in technology, security procedures, and threat environments that had occurred during his years away from government service. The technology has advanced significantly since my original government career, he acknowledged. But the fundamental principles of electronic warfare and navigation systems remain consistent enough that the learning curve has been manageable. Their conversation continued as the flight progressed toward Washington, covering topics related to aviation security, technological advancement, and the evolving nature of threats to civilian transportation infrastructure. David found Torres to be an insightful conversationalist who understood both the technical and operational implications of the challenges they discussed. Her perspectives informed by practical experience with commercial aviation operations and security procedures. As their flight began its descent toward Dulles International Airport, David reflected on the remarkable coincidence that had brought him together with Captain Torres for a second time, 2 years after their shared emergency experience had fundamentally altered his life trajectory. Their conversation had provided valuable perspective on the personal and professional implications of his return to government service, insights that would inform his ongoing work on electronic warfare countermeasures and aviation security programs. The successful landing at Dulles represented another routine completion of civilian air travel, protected by defensive systems that David's team had developed and deployed throughout the commercial aviation fleet. The passengers aboard their flight were unaware of the electronic warfare threats that could have compromised their navigation and communication systems, protection that remained invisible until circumstances required its activation. As they departed the aircraft and prepared to go their separate ways in the Dulles terminal, Torres paused to offer final observations about their unexpected reunion and its implications for David's ongoing work. I hope your programs continue to be successful at protecting civilian aviation, she said. Those of us who experienced electronic warfare firsthand understand how serious these threats can be. David appreciated Torres's recognition of the importance of his work, while understanding that their chance encounter had provided valuable confirmation that the defensive measures his team had developed were functioning effectively in operational environments. It's been meaningful work that contributes to protecting millions of travelers from sophisticated threats they never see, he replied. Their parting at Dulles International Airport marked the conclusion of an unexpected reunion that had provided both personal satisfaction and professional validation for David's decision to return to government service. The conversation with Torres had confirmed that his expertise was making tangible contributions to aviation security, while highlighting the ongoing nature of electronic warfare threats that required sustained attention and continuous technical advancement. As David made his way through the terminal toward his connecting flight to classified briefings in Washington, he reflected on how his involvement in Flight 1847's emergency had led to meaningful work protecting American transportation infrastructure from foreign intelligence operations. The passenger who had reluctantly stepped forward to provide technical assistance during a civilian aviation crisis had become a senior government consultant, whose expertise was considered essential for national security programs of strategic importance. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.